Today we talk about the Buffalo Sabers. Will they have the offensive firepower to win games? Can they make the playoffs with a mediocre team? This is Hockey Sense, and I'm your host, Joshua Kessner. Today we talk about another mediocre team from the Atlantic. Last week we talked about the Boston Bruins, and we are going in alphabetical order. And so Buffalo is the next one up. But last week we talked about Boston. If you want to listen to what I said about Boston, you can go and check that out. It's last week's podcast. Feel free to check that out. I also have Anaheim and Arizona. I talked about them. And today we're talking about the Buffalo Sabers. And I do these every week. Every weekend is when I post or try to post. So feel free to tune in, subscribe, follow, whatever you want to do. And yeah, come in every weekend and you might be able to check this out. So let's talk about my current overall outline for how this is going to work. So first I'm going to talk about unrestricted free agents. These are people who are not signed by the team but are worth mentioning, and the team should either pick them up or get rid of them, one of the two. Then we talk about the overall team with pickups of players and that kind of thing. So we talk about the pros, and then we talk about the cons. We have two different sections for that. Then the last section we talk about unknown factors. These are either players or coaches or team play, that kind of thing, that we have no previous experience with them in this organization and how they're going to respond, react, work out in this organization, that kind of thing. And so we have no basis for how they're going to play or coach. And we want to be as objective as possible. So that is what I'm trying to do, and just saying these are unknowns. I don't know how they're going to play, and then I'll talk about that in further detail. All right, so let's jump right into this. So we're going to talk about the unrestricted free agents first. So Buffalo is much like Boston of last week, if you listened to Boston of last week when I talked, that they didn't really have a whole lot of unrestricted free agents really worth mentioning, except for one, and that's Rasmus Ristolainen. Now, Ristolainen is a defenseman, and he's got some decent numbers for the Buffalo Sabers. Some decent goals, some decent points, some decent assists. So overall, Ristolainen is a producing defenseman for the Buffalo Sabers. And it looks like he's a decent defenseman overall. So it doesn't look like he's a terrible defenseman. So, since he's the only one, this section is going to be quite short. But we are going to talk about what about the other unrestricted free agents, because there are other unrestricted free agents, but I didn't think they were worth mentioning. And here's why. A lot of them were players that were either I just didn't know, and even when I looked at their records and their NHL stats and that kind of thing, they didn't seem like they were even worth either keeping or signing, because their point values were so low, and out of the games they played, it was awful. But a lot of them were also AHL players. So I didn't know any of them really, and because of that, I don't know anything really about them. So I didn't really think it was worth bringing them up. Ristolainen, on the other hand, has played for the Buffalo Sabres for a decent amount of time. So I think he's the only one that's really worth bringing up in this segment. So Ristolainen he fits all the aspects that I think the Buffalo Sabres need. They need point-producing defensemen, and they need defensemen who can produce on the defensive end as well. Ristolainen seems to fit that role pretty well, and I'm not going to sit here and say he's the best defenseman, because I don't think he is. I think he's a pretty average defenseman. But I think the thing that makes him so necessary for the Buffalo Sabres is the fact that he produces points on the offensive end. So I think that's an important role for the Buffalo Sabres, not only having good forwards, but having good defensemen to help out on the point production. And I think he is definitely a player worth picking up for the Buffalo Sabres since he is not signed by anyone as of yet. So I really think Buffalo should pick him up. If not, he will get picked up somewhere else probably. I wouldn't say anywhere like, I don't know, out of the East, like Tampa Bay or New York Rangers or Pittsburgh or anything like that. I don't think that'll happen. But I think he'll get picked up, somewhere. That's an average team. Maybe even a little bit better than the Buffalo Sabres. But we will talk about what I think about the Buffalo Sabres a little later. But yeah, I think Buffalo needs to pick him up for sure. Now, let's talk about the current overall team setup. So, let's talk about the pros. Well, obviously, the biggest pro is Jack Eichel. If you don't know who Jack Eichel is, watch a Buffalo Sabres game, and he's the star player. Jack Eichel is quite an amazing hockey player for the Buffalo Sabres, and he did some really good production for his rookie year because it was quite good to see him doing well. I think he definitely fit on their team pretty decently. I think the only thing that hurt Jack Eichel was the fact that he's playing on the Buffalo Sabres. If he was playing on a better team such as, maybe like a New York Rangers or a Pittsburgh Penguins or somewhere that allowed him to have more speed, Tampa Bay, a team that allowed him to use his speed a little bit better, I think he would really shine. And plus, they have a few better players on those teams as well. But the good thing is Buffalo is not a big, heavy-hitting team compared to some other teams. They actually are pretty much in the middle. They got some decent size, but they also got some decent speed. They're not really one way or the other. Probably a little bit more on the speed end, but other than that, I mean, they still got some really decent size on them. Jack Eichel is probably the biggest plus for the Buffalo Sabres. And this year, I can't wait to see what he does. We also have players like Gianta, O'Reilly, Reinhart. We got some decent players and some decent point production out of some of these players, and those are definitely good pros. These are all forwards and centers. And I think the biggest pickup that I think it will be a plus, but I'm going to put him also in the unknown factor because I don't know how he'll play with the Buffalo Sabres organization, is Kyle Okposo. And Kyle Okposo played for the New York Islanders last year. I thought he was one of the more deadly players on the New York Islanders team. In fact, the fact that he played with John Tavares, that was a decent duo right there between the two. And there were some decent points produced between those two players. So I think Kyle Okposo, he came to a team that needed some offensive production a little bit more other than just Jack Eichel. And Kyle Okposo definitely fits that role, and he's definitely going to help out. The question is, will he fit into the team setup? And Kyle Okposo definitely fit into the Islanders team setup and was a big threat for teams that played the New York Islanders. And so it'll be interesting to see how he plays with the Buffalo Sabres. I'm quite astonished, really, that the Islanders got rid of Okposo because I thought he was one of their more deadly players. And the fact that the Islanders got rid of him makes me wonder what they're doing in the Islanders organization. But we'll talk about them later. So, yeah, I don't know what the Islanders were thinking, but it's a big plus for the Buffalo Sabres organization to pick up Okposo. Like I said, O'Reilly and Reinhart, all these players are outstanding players, really. Just outstanding players. And overall, they're team setup is quite good when it comes to those players right there. Now, let's talk about the cons of the Buffalo Sabers. So the cons of the Buffalo Sabers are, number one, they have poor goalies. Very, very poor goalies, in fact. I mean, I looked at their stats, and I was quite astonished. I was like, where are their goalies? Who's going to be their starting goalie? They were that bad. Defensive play. So they have one or two decent defensemen, but the question comes: are they going to actually play defense? Because you can have an average, like a above average goalie in net, and have an outstanding defense and still win games. But if you don't play defense and you have some goalies that are not that great compared to some other goalies, such as Carey Price, Henrik Lundqvist, Corey Crawford, Jonathan Quick, John Gibson on the Anaheim Ducks, Matt Murray on the Pittsburgh Penguins. I mean, I could list other goalies that are just so much stronger than the goalies they have here. I mean, Ben Bishop on the Tampa Bay Lightning. There's another one right there. I mean, it's just these goalies get squashed when it comes to other goalies that are in the league. So the question is their defense going to step up for that and help out their stats? Because I think these goalies could potentially be okay. I don't know where they stand in the NHL in terms of stats and all that, but I think they could come out with decent stat records this year if their defensive play came and was actually really, really strong this year. But as it is right now, I'm not quite sure where their defense is. I mean, I remember watching a couple games of Buffalo last year and seeing them on TV, and their defense was just so porous compared to some of the other teams, and they were playing some pretty average teams. And I was quite baffled to see how high some of the scores were. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if their defense comes out to show this year, because it definitely needs to come out and be a threat in the NHL in order for them to make the playoffs. Even if they do make the playoffs, their goalies have to step up if they want to get anywhere in the playoffs, because you could have amazing defense and terrible goalies and still lose games. So I think they need to have at least one better goalie. I don't know who they picked up this year, or for some reason I thought they got rid of some goalie, but I'm not quite sure on that. But I remember the years when Miller was Buffalo's goalie, and he was an outstanding goalie and still is. And I was quite baffled to see Buffalo get rid of him when he traded him to Vancouver. And now who do they have in net? I don't even know half of the goalies. I don't know who they are, number one, and their stats are so bad. They're not really impressive enough to even talk about. So it's just, I don't know. Their goalies definitely need to step up, or they need to pick up a new goalie, trade for a goalie, whatever. They need to get another goalie for sure, in my opinion. But defensive play, I think, can be fixed by making the team play defense better. The goalie situation, I don't know what to. You just need to trade for another goalie, in my opinion. All right, so this comes to the last segment that I want to talk about, which is the unknown factors. Let's talk about unknowns. So Kyle Okposo, as I mentioned earlier, I think he'll be a pro and a plus for the team, but right now he stands as an unknown. We don't know how he'll fit into this organization, or if he will fit into this organization. And I think it's worth bringing up, because if we don't bring him up, then we're ignoring the fact that he's new to the organization. So I think Kyle Okposo will be a plus, but as of right now, he still stands as an unknown because we don't know how he'll fit into the organization. Will he be on the same line as Jack Eichel? Will he be on the second line? I don't know. I think there's so many questions when it comes to where to put Kyle Okposo and how he'll play that it's worthy enough to put him in the unknown factors. All right. Second to last thing, defense. Defense, will it show up this year? Last year, it showed up kind of at the back half of the season. But, I mean, they were so far down in the Atlantic Division that it wasn't even worth fighting for, really. I mean, they were second to last. Toronto was below them, and Toronto was the last team in the Atlantic Division. Above Buffalo, there was Montreal, Ottawa, and Boston. Those three teams did not make the playoffs. The teams that did make the playoffs were Detroit, Tampa Bay, and Florida. All right, Detroit, Tampa Bay, and Florida all have decent teams. Now, Detroit is on the older side, and I don't know. Every year I sit there and I question, I'm like, will they make the playoffs this year? And then somehow they magically turn around and make the playoffs, but they don't get very far because their team is so old that they need to get rid of some players and bring in some fresh blood. So, and they've started to do that. But Detroit and Boston kept flip-flopping. And it was Boston one week, then Detroit the next, and Detroit somehow came out with that. But anyways, there are 6 teams ahead of Buffalo that all have better records from last year before even by the time they got to the playoffs. And this year, the question still remains, will they be able to beat teams like Montreal, Ottawa, Boston, who didn't make the playoffs? And will they be able to beat teams like Florida, Tampa Bay, and Detroit, who did make the playoffs and still have very strong teams? Because you have to beat those teams in order to make the playoffs. And those teams have pretty decent defense. Even Boston has decent defense compared to Buffalo. Ottawa has decent defense compared to Buffalo, and Montreal has some decent defense compared to Buffalo. Although theirs is going to be an interesting year this year because they got rid of PK Subban and picked up Shea Weber, so we'll see how that pans out for them. But even so, they still got a top defenseman for a top defenseman. Buffalo has none of that. So the question remains for Buffalo. Can you beat those teams with your offensive firepower with Jack Eichel, Gianta, Okposo, O'Reilly, and Reinhart, and potentially picking up Ristolainen, with some very poor defensive play and some awful goalies in net? Can you make the playoffs? And even if you do make the playoffs, will you get past the first round? So, first of all, I don't watch a lot of Buffalo, but of the times I did watch Buffalo, granted I'm a New York Rangers fan and an Anaheim Ducks fan, so I am a little biased. But to be as objective as possible here, of the times I did watch Buffalo, their defense was not there, and it was pretty poor. They were on one night, and then they lose the next 3 games. That's kind of how I picture Buffalo. They win one game, and then they lose the next 3. And that's not something you want consistently out of your regular season. I don't see Buffalo making the playoffs this year. They haven't made enough changes for me to go, yeah, now they're a dominant team in the NHL. It's just not going to happen. They're going to stay where they are, and they're going to be bottom of the Atlantic Division again, probably. Toronto may jump ahead of them now that they got a decent goaltender and they got Matthews as one of their. They got the overall number 1 pick with Matthews. Toronto might jump over them, and they got Babcock as a coach, which helps them out. I don't know. Buffalo is just such a... It's a sad sight to watch, in my opinion, because I think they could be so much better than what they are. But I'm not quite sure they're there. And I don't know. As someone who has watched enough hockey from them to know they're not going to make the playoffs, it's it's quite sad really because I want more diverse teams to be in the playoffs. But it's clear to me this year that they will not make the playoffs just with their overall team that they have right now. Their team is okay, but even if they get to middle of the pack, they're still not going to make the playoffs. I don't see them making the playoffs at all. So we can hope maybe for the next in the later years, 3 years down the road, 4 years down the road, when they pick up some good players and Jack Eichel and some of the younger players that they pick up mature and build some legit team chemistry, and become a threat in the NHL, that could potentially happen. So, but I highly doubt that they're going to make the playoffs this upcoming year. Yeah, it's just facts that have convinced me of this. Stats with their terrible goalies, their defensive plays, really terrible, and their offensive play is average, I think. But when you come up against when you put Buffalo's team against the top teams in the league, even outside of their division, all right? So let's say they even clinch a spot in the Atlantic Division, all right? So here are the teams in the Atlantic Division who they would probably have to play: Florida, Tampa Bay, Detroit, or Boston. Those would be the teams that I would suspect make the playoffs this year. And then if they get past them, then they have to play against teams in the Metropolitan Division. They have to play against teams like Washington, Pittsburgh, the New York Rangers, and the New York Islanders / Philadelphia. Those would be the teams. All those teams outplay them. They outplay Buffalo 100%. All right, now let's compare them to the Central Division. All right, the most deadly division in the entire NHL. Right, we got Dallas, St. Louis, Chicago, Nashville, Minnesota. All those teams are all teams that you put Buffalo up against them, and everyone's gonna immediately pick the opposing team to Buffalo. Right. All right, now let's go to the Pacific Division, which is a lot softer than the Central Division. But even still, you have Anaheim, you have the LA Kings, you have the San Jose Sharks, all heavy hitting, all stacked teams, all loaded with good goalies, all just overall good teams, right? You have Arizona, while they're probably on the same level as Buffalo this year, but they're at least going to go further than Buffalo, in my opinion, when it comes to future years, like 2 or 3 years down the road. You have Calgary, Vancouver. Vancouver even outplays Buffalo. And Edmonton's about on the same level, although I could see Edmonton doing better than Buffalo this year, but not much better. But I still think Edmonton is much like Buffalo, but Buffalo still, they're on the same playing field. But those are the only two teams that are on the same playing field, other than maybe Toronto. You put Buffalo and Toronto and Edmonton in the same category as, like teams that are probably going to be in the bottom of the league this year, or bottom half of the league, then yeah, I mean, everyone's going to say probably, yeah, they're at the bottom of the league. So that's my thing, is all these things just don't add up to Buffalo being in the playoffs this year. In terms of team play, I think in the next couple of years, when I say couple of years, I mean like 4 or 5 years down the road, we can see them being a decent team, making a push for the playoffs. They won't win a Stanley Cup probably unless they make some major impressive trades, or pick up some impressive players. They won't win a Stanley Cup, or they'll be pushing for the playoffs, but they probably won't get very far. But their development, in my eyes, is pretty slow compared to some other teams like Arizona, which I think their development's going to be really fast because they have some talent on their team. But anyways, that's going off in a little tangent there, but I mean, that's my honest opinion. When I look at the Buffalo Sabers, they're not going to make the playoffs. Like I said, their defense is not good enough, and they don't have good goalies. They have some decent offensive firepower, but that's about it. So, yeah, that's what I have to say about the Buffalo Sabers. If you're a Buffalo Sabers fan, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Will they make the playoffs? Do you disagree with me? If so, why? And yeah, let me know. Follow, favorite, like, subscribe, whatever you're listening to this on, SoundCloud or YouTube. Yeah, just leave a comment down below if you want to hear more of this stuff. Again, I'm posting these on weekends. So once a weekend, we're going to talk about a different team. So next week, we are going to talk about another team, and they're going to be quite an interesting team to talk about. Let me see if I can pull it up here. Hold on. We are going to talk about the Calgary Flames. So next week we're going to talk about the Calgary Flames, and we'll talk about them, where they stand, much like we did with Boston, Buffalo, Arizona, and Anaheim. So, yeah, feel free to tune into that. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I know I went a little bit off on a rant at the very end there, but I hope you guys still enjoyed nonetheless. Tune in for more of this stuff. Like I said, I'm trying to post this more consistently. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you guys in the next one.